Imagine opening your laptop tomorrow morning and being told your operating system is now, technically, breaking federal law. Not because you pirated anything, not because you did a single thing wrong, but because the software running your machine has no way to ask you for your date of birth before letting you use it. No login screen asking, how old are you? No corporate office to send a compliance form to. Just code, free, open, built by volunteers scattered across the planet. And Washington just decided that code needs to grow up. This isn't a thought experiment. It's a real bill sitting in Congress right now, and it's called the Parents Decide Act, H.R. 8250. It was introduced on April 13th, 2026 by Representative Josh Gottheimer, a Democrat from New Jersey, with Republican Representative Elise Stefanik of New York as an original co-sponsor, and Republican Brian Fitzpatrick of Pennsylvania, signing on shortly after. A bipartisan bill, and that detail alone should make you sit up, because when members from opposite ends of the political spectrum agree on something in this Congress, it tends to move quietly and faster than people expect. So let's actually break down what this bill says, what's happened to it since April, why the Linux and open source community reacted with genuine alarm, and this is the part that's changed even since the initial headlines, what's shifted just in the last 2 months that most people covering this story still haven't caught up on. Because this isn't only a story about Linux nerds panicking over a hobby operating system. This is a story about who actually owns the device sitting in your hands, you or the government. Here's the core mechanism of the bill in plain terms. Every operating system provider in the United States would be required to verify the age of every user before that user can set up an account or use the operating system. If that user is under 18, the provider has to get a parent or legal guardian to verify their date of birth instead. And then comes the part that really escalates things. The bill requires every operating system provider to build an API, a programming interface, that lets any app developer reach in and pull that age data. So the moment you download any app on your machine, that app can ask your operating system, how old is this person? And the operating system is legally required to answer. Read the bill's actual title because it doesn't hedge. To require operating system providers to verify the age of any user of an operating system, and for other purposes. 6 pages. According to the official summary published on congress.gov, this covers software that supports the basic functions of any computer, mobile device, or general-purpose computing device. That is about as broad as legislative language gets. Not social media platforms, not app stores, every operating system. For a company like Apple or Google, this is a headache, not an emergency. They already run massive identity infrastructure. They have legal departments the size of small law firms. They'll lobby, they'll negotiate, and eventually they'll build the compliance layer because they have the resources and the centralized structure to do it. But Linux has not built anything like that, and that's exactly where this story gets interesting. To understand why this bill created a genuine panic in open source circles, you have to understand what Linux actually is. Linux isn't a company. There's no CEO of Linux, no headquarters, no single legal entity you could serve a compliance notice to, because no single entity ships it. Linux is a kernel, developed collaboratively by thousands of contributors around the world, and from that kernel, hundreds of distributions are built. Ubuntu, Fedora, Debian, Arch, Mint, Pop, OS, and many more, most maintained by small nonprofits, loose volunteer communities, or sometimes literally one person coding in their spare time after work. When you want Linux, you go to a website, download a file, flash it to a USB drive, and boot from it. There's no account creation, no identity check, no gate of any kind. That absence of a gatekeeper isn't a bug, it's the entire founding philosophy of open source software. The tools and knowledge should be free, accessible, and not owned or controlled by any single authority. And the Parents Decide Act, as written in April 2026, walks straight into that philosophy and effectively says, not anymore, not without a provider we can hold accountable. The technical critique that exploded across developer forums and tech news sites the moment this bill's text became public boils down to one structural flaw. The entire law assumes there's always a single identifiable operating system provider who can be held legally responsible for verifying every user. That assumption is airtight for Apple. It's airtight for Google. It completely falls apart the moment you point it at Linux, because there is no Apple of Linux to fine, to sue, or to force into compliance. So what happens when a law assumes a structure that doesn't exist for an entire category of software millions of people rely on? Every day, that's exactly where we're headed next, and where the real fight over the last few months actually took place. So if there's no single company to hold accountable, who actually enforces this thing, and how? The bill designates the Federal Trade Commission as the enforcement agency, and here's where the legislation gets genuinely strange. It doesn't actually spell out how any of this technical verification is supposed to work. Instead, it gives the FTC 180 days after the bill becomes law to figure out the implementation details. In other words, Congress is being asked to pass a law before anyone, including the agency responsible for enforcing it, knows how compliance is technically supposed to happen. One compliance analysis covering the bill put it bluntly: it's staggeringly broad in scope and remarkably long on things it punts to other agencies to sort out later. 6 months to solve a technical and legal problem the entire tech industry hasn't cracked in 3 decades. But here's the thing: none of this came out of nowhere. H.R. 8250 is the federal version of a wave of state laws that had already been slamming into Linux communities for months before Gottheimer introduced his bill. California moved first. Governor Gavin Newsom signed the Digital Age Assurance Act, AB 1043, back in October 2025, requiring any operating system provider in the state, and the definition was written deliberately wide, to collect age data from every user at setup and push that data to API. Developers through a live API. It sorted users into 4 brackets: under 13, 13 to under 16, 16 to under 18, and 18 or older, with an original effective date of January 1st, 2027. Colorado followed with a nearly identical bill, which passed its state. Senate 28-7 in early March 2026. Louisiana had its own version set to take effect in July 2026. Illinois was drafting something similar. State by state, the dominoes were falling, and the federal bill arrived a few weeks later to try to unify all of it into one national standard. The fallout inside the actual Linux codebase was immediate and, frankly, ugly. A developer submitted a pull request adding a birth date field into Systemed, the init software that boots most Linux-based systems, explicitly citing California's and Colorado's bills as the justification. That single pull request generated more than 900 comments, outrage, even threats, and a privacy-focused fork of the project sprang up in direct response. The maintainers merged the change anyway in mid-March 2026. Think about what that actually means. Legislative pressure from a handful of state capitals had already reached all the way down into the code that boots your machine before the federal bill even existed. Other corners of the open source world drew harder lines. The team behind DB48X, an open source calculator firmware project, issued a formal notice stating flatly that their software does not, cannot, and will not implement age verification. Full stop. Midnight BSD updated its license to exclude users in Brazil entirely after that country's own age verification law, the digital ECA law, took effect in March 2026, carrying fines north of $9 million per violation for non-compliant operating system providers. Over 400 computer scientists signed an open letter arguing these laws build surveillance infrastructure without meaningfully protecting a single child. And then there's Graphene OS, a privacy-hardened, security-focused version of Android built by a nonprofit and a volunteer community, which posted a statement in March 2026 that became something close to a rallying cry across the entire open source world. Their position, in essence: Graphene OS will remain usable by anyone, anywhere, without requiring personal information, identification, or an account, and if that means it can't legally be distributed in a given region, so be it. Read that again. A piece of software telling an entire government that it would rather exit the market than become a surveillance tool. That's the level this conflict had escalated to by spring 2026. Now, to be fair to the lawmakers here, they weren't reacting to nothing. This entire wave traces back to the Kids Online Safety Act, first introduced back in 2022 by Senators Richard Blumenthal and Marsha Blackburn, which passed the Senate 91-3 in July 2024. A landslide, not a close vote. That vote happened because families showed up to Capitol Hill hearings with photographs of children who had died, kids targeted by drug dealers through social media, kids fed dangerous viral challenges by recommendation, algorithms teenagers push towards self-harm content after breakups. Those aren't statistics. Those are names. And parents who buried their children. The American Academy of Pediatrics and the American Psychological Association both back this kind of legislation. The disagreement isn't about whether kids need protection online. Everyone agrees they do. The disagreement is about whether bolting age verification onto the operating system layer is the mechanism that actually accomplishes that, or whether it just quietly dismantles the last corners of computing that no single corporation controls, while doing very little to stop the 12-year-old who simply types in a fake birthday. And here's where the story takes a turn that most of the coverage from earlier this year completely missed, because the fight didn't just stay stuck at that ugly standoff between lawmakers and developers. Something actually shifted in the months since. A real, documented, verifiable win for the open source side, sitting quietly in bill text that most people haven't read yet. Here's the update that changes this entire story, and it's recent enough that most explainer videos floating around right now still haven't caught up to it. Remember System 76, CEO Carl Richell, the maker of the POP? OS Linux distribution, who'd been vocal about these bills shifting blame away from the companies that actually built addictive algorithms? Back in April 2026, Richell confirmed he'd been in direct talks with Colorado State Senator Matt Ball, one of the co-authors of Colorado's age verification bill, specifically pushing to get open source software carved out of the law entirely. And by late May 2026, that push actually worked. The finalized version of Colorado's bill, Senate Bill 26051, now includes explicit language exempting operating systems, distributed under license terms that let recipients copy, redistribute, and modify the software without platform-imposed restrictions. In plain English, if your OS is genuinely open source, licensed the way Debian, Fedora, and Arch actually are, you are not what this law is targeting. The bill's final text even closes the loophole manufacturers might have used to lock down hardware while keeping code technically open, a practice sometimes called TiVoization, ensuring the exemption can't be gamed. Colorado's law is now scheduled to take effect July 1st, 2028. California followed the same path. Assemblymember Buffy Wicks, the original author of AB 1043, introduced a follow-up bill in February 2026 specifically to fix the open source blind spot in her own earlier legislation after the same backlash that hit System and Graphene OS made it clear the original bill would have swept up every small Linux distro maintained by volunteers. After 4 rounds of revisions, California's updated bill rewrote the definition of operating system provider to exclude anyone distributing software under those same copy, redistribute, modify terms. As of early June 2026, most standard Linux distributions cleanly fall outside the scope of California's Law 2, which is still on track for a January 1st, 2027 effective date for the platforms it does cover. So here's where things actually stand as of right now. 2 of the states that kicked off this entire crisis, the 2 states whose bills triggered the system pull request, the Graphene OS statement, the Midnight BSD ban on Brazilian users, have both walked back and explicitly protected open source operating systems from their own laws. That's not a rumor. That's not open source developers cheering prematurely. That's enrolled bill text on the record in both states. Graphene OS and System 76 both treated it as a genuine hard-won victory, while cautioning that a statutory exemption written today can always become tomorrow's target for amendment once enforcement actually begins and lawmakers look for the next loophole to close. But, and this is the part that should stop you from exhaling just yet, none of that state-level relief automatically applies to the federal bill we started this video with. H.R. 8250, the Parents Decide Act, as introduced on April 13, 2026, contains no open source exemption whatsoever. As of the most recent legislative tracking in early July 2026, the bill remains exactly where it started, referred to the House Committee on Energy and Commerce, sitting with just 2 Republican co-sponsors alongside its original sponsors, with no committee vote scheduled and no markup session held yet. It hasn't advanced. It also hasn't died. It's sitting in exactly the kind of legislative limbo where a bill can either quietly stall for the rest of the session or suddenly get attached to a larger package and move fast, especially with the same bipartisan momentum that's been driving child safety legislation since the Kids Online Safety Act passed the Senate 91-3 back in 2024. This is precisely why the state-level exemptions matter so much right now, and why open source advocates are treating them as a template rather than a finish line. Carl Richell publicly called the Colorado language a sound template for other states, and by extension for Congress, to work from. If lawmakers drafting or amending H.R. 8250 look at what Colorado and California ultimately settled on, there's now a proven, tested, legal framework sitting right there for carving Linux and other genuinely open source projects out of the federal bill's reach, without weakening the actual child protection mechanism the bill is aimed at for Apple, Google, Microsoft, and every major closed platform provider. And whether Gottheimer's office, the Energy and Commerce Committee, or anyone pushing this bill forward chooses to adopt that same language is right now an open question. And it's one that will get decided in committee rooms most people never think to watch. Meanwhile, the underlying privacy concerns baked into the bill's design haven't gone anywhere, regardless of what happens with any open source carve-out. The bill still requires every covered operating system to build an API exposing your birth date to any app. Developer who requests it, meaning every compliant OS in the country, becomes a node in a nationwide, queryable database linking birth dates to device identities. Security researchers have flagged that kind of centralized structure as an extraordinarily attractive target for a single catastrophic breach. And the bill's own data protection language has been described by compliance analysts as aspirational at best, since the actual technical safeguards are, again, left for the FTC to invent within that same tight 180-day window. An exemption for Linux doesn't fix that problem for the roughly 3 billion Windows, macOS, iOS, and Android users. This bill would still directly cover. So where does that leave the bigger picture? Genuinely uncertain and moving faster than most coverage has kept up with. The open source community won a real, meaningful fight at the state level in Colorado and California. But the federal version of this fight, the one with actual national reach, the one that would set a template every other state might eventually copy, is still sitting in committee, still without protection for the very communities that just won that fight one level down. And that's exactly the piece of this story that determines what happens next. So let's zoom all the way out, because there's one more layer to this fight that determines whether any of what we just covered actually holds up: the courts. Even if H.R. 8250 clears committee, even if it eventually adopts the same open source language Colorado and California landed on, laws like this don't just sail through unchallenged. They get sued immediately, and the legal terrain here is already active. In December 2025, a federal judge blocked Texas's SB 2420, its own App Store age verification law, on First Amendment grounds. That injunction was preliminary, and the Fifth Circuit later stayed it, allowing the Texas law to actually take effect on June 4th, 2026, while the underlying constitutional question heads toward the Supreme Court. That's not a settled outcome. That's a live, unresolved fight playing out in real time, and it's the closest legal preview we have for how a federal age verification mandate might eventually be tested in court. There's real precedent behind that skepticism, too. Back in 1999, in Bernstein versus Department of Justice, a federal court ruled that computer code itself is protected speech under the First Amendment. That single ruling is why groups like the Electronic Frontier Foundation, the ACLU, and the Center for Democracy and Technology have consistently argued that forcing open source developers to write specific surveillance features into their software against their will raises serious, compelled speech questions. The same category of argument that's historically been used to strike down government attempts to control what booksellers could put on their shelves. NetChoice, a tech industry trade group, has already signaled it's watching this exact category of law for a First Amendment challenge. None of these court fights move quickly. They take years, but legislation doesn't wait for courts to catch up, which is exactly why the next 6 to 12 months of committee activity around H.R. 8250 matter more than most people currently realize. Here's the tension that this entire story ultimately comes down to, and it's worth sitting with instead of rushing past. Nobody. Sirius is arguing children don't need protection online. The Kids Online Safety Act passed the Senate 91-3 because families brought real grief into that hearing room. Real kids, real names. That pressure is legitimate, and it isn't going away. But California's original age law, the one that kicked off this entire chain reaction, never actually required a photo ID, a face, scan, or a government document, just a self-reported birthday typed into a form. A resourceful 12-year-old types in a fake year and walks straight through. Professor Eric Goldman at Santa Clara University summed up the actual mechanism of these laws about as plainly as it can be said. Every time an age verification mandate goes into effect, the internet shrinks, but not evenly. It shrinks for the ordinary, honest, legitimate users. It shrinks for the 6-person volunteer team maintaining a Linux distro with zero legal budget. It barely touches the tech-savvy kid who wants around it. And there's a structural detail worth remembering here, too. Under laws like these, once a major platform is verified compliant, its liability for what happens on it tends to shrink right along with the mandate's supposed protections, which is part of why some of the very companies whose algorithms fueled this crisis in the first place have quietly supported pushing verification down onto the operating system layer instead of their own platforms. So where does this actually leave things right now in the middle of 2026, Colorado and California? The two states that lit the fuse on this entire fight have both walked back and explicitly protected genuinely open source software from their own laws after sustained pressure from people like Carl Richel and the developers behind Graphene OS, who flatly refused to build surveillance into their own code. That's a real, hard-won, documented win, and it proves something important. This fight is winnable when the people who understand what's actually at stake show up in the room where the bill text gets written. But the federal bill, H.R. 8250, the one with the power to set a single national standard that every state eventually falls in line behind, is still sitting in the House Energy and Commerce Committee with only a handful of co-sponsors, no open source exemption. In its current text, and a 180-day clock that hasn't even started ticking yet because the bill hasn't passed. That's the moment we're actually in. Not a Linux is already illegal moment, but that headline is premature and honestly, kind of lazy. but a genuinely pivotal one where the decisions being hashed out in a handful of committee rooms in Washington over the next several months will decide whether the framework that just protected open source software in 2 states gets adopted nationally, or whether millions of people relying on Windows, macOS, iOS, and Android end up living under one standard, while a legally protected island of open source computing exists right next to it, permanently split along a line that Congress is still arguing about. Whether you've ever touched a Linux terminal or not, this is worth watching, because the actual question underneath all of this has nothing to do with operating systems specifically. It's whether a person in the United States has the right to use a computer without the government, or an app developer, or a data broker 3 steps removed from either, knowing exactly how old you are. That question is going to shape how computing works in this country for a long time, and right now, it's still being decided. So here's what actually matters going forward. This bill is not dead, and it is not law. It's sitting in limbo, and that's exactly the stage where public pressure and committee attention change outcomes, the same way it just did in Colorado. If this story matters to you, follow how H.R. 8250 moves through the Energy and Commerce Committee over the coming months, because that committee vote is going to tell you more about the future of this bill than any headline will. Hit like if this actually helped. You understand what's really going on underneath the panic. Subscribe if you want the next update on this bill the moment it moves, and drop a comment telling me whether you think Congress should follow Colorado and California's lead and exempt open source. I want to know where you land on this before the committee does.